Hi everyone, welcome. We're checking in today with the mixed red worms, where a couple feedings ago we decided to put them on a coffee-only feeding regimen. So these systems are now 9 weeks of age, 63 days of age, fed 5 times so far, and that last coffee feeding was 13 days ago. I'm not sure if the estimated worm counts for these systems have been announced yet, but after 9 weeks in service, more than a couple months in service, I think the estimates coming in from the viewers in the comments on worm count amounts has settled down to the point where we shouldn't see many more changes. But I usually withhold announcing or publishing those bits of info until I feel like they're going to remain relatively unchanged. So here we've got some of this sugar bag, double bag. If you ever buy sugar or flour, I think is also double bagged. You'll know that this is a good tough bag, which originally rested out here on the surface as our only top covering. But a couple check-ins ago we decided that we wanted to help the systems preserve their moisture content, so in came these bubble wrap top coverings. And it does seem like they've been doing a really nice job. I could see things are quite damp out here on the surface. This paper top covering is pretty damp. Our feeding zone indicators have some moisture seeped into them. And I did come prepared with a couple replacement feeding zone indicators. Because originally the idea here was that not only would there be a coffee only diet imposed on these worms, which is what they're getting, there was going to be this whole idea of how the bedding would be only coffee filters, but for me to keep up with that would be difficult, so I'm allowing myself the latitude to apply leaves where I want, bring in my prepared bedding where I want, and the bedding we're going to be a little bit more creative on. After all, the only food that these guys are getting is coffee, and look at all that activity right out here on the surface. So if they want any sort of variety in their diet, they're going to have to turn to those old corn cobs. So one of the early feedings here before the imposition of the coffee only diet was a couple corn cobs. And they're getting pretty fragile, but I've been resisting the temptation to break them up. Oh, here's a stem of a pumpkin. Here's a piece of corn cob. I mean, this thing would shatter if I started. I mean, I can feel how soft it is. It's just totally pliable here in my hand. Now it's started to break along its length. And I did sort of promise myself that I would help the corn cobs along rather than always trying to help them remain and stay. I'll try to change my focus to helping the stuff break down versus always trying to set it aside and be careful and tiptoe around it and not affect its breakdown process. Here too, a pumpkin stem. So we do have a couple novelty items that made their way into these bins before coffee was imposed, so I suppose if the worms need a little change of pace, there's corn cob, pumpkin stem. Alright, so these corn cobs are about the same length now that I've chipped off the end of the larger one. And I think besides coffee and bedding, I think there's a great deal of value in including a good bit of moisture, more so here than in any of my other systems. Every other system where we put in frozen food scraps, different types of vegetable matter, different types of fruity foods, most of those coming in with their own juice content, help add to the system's moisture level. But here we're bringing in only a type of food which is basically dry. There's very little, if any, moisture content that you can chalk up to coming in via the coffee. I mean, it's true that the coffee is damp in most cases. I mean, I don't dry it out per se, but even here, if you look inside this container, this stuff's been sitting around, so it's relatively dry. If it has any moisture content at all, it's minimal. Even when I pull something straight out of the coffee machine, the majority of the moisture that had been passing through that stuff has already passed through and has been made available for human consumption. So the coffee that gets given to the worms, even though it's possibly damp still, is certainly no source for moisture. So seems like certain things that have been making their way down into the feeding zone, supplementary bedding items, are sort of sticking around. Kind of makes me wonder if we really even want to bring in these old coffee filters from last time. Should we? Yeah, you know what? Why not? Got to give them some sort of bedding, and if you look at the pace at which the bedding's breaking down, relatively slow, if you ask me. I guess it probably does make sense to put it in and let it start breaking down slowly. If that's the pace at which it's going to go, then the sooner it gets in, the better. Let's make sure we take all these slow composting objects, get them into play, and before we get too far in here and we start backfilling this feeding zone, like I said before, we've got this really important ingredient, which is the moisture. So I gave the squirt bottle a nice charge, pumped it up before starting the camera, just to make sure that once I do decide dispensing moisture, it's going to be quick. This stuff is flowing out of here fast, applying a lot of moisture, and being generous with the moisture here, I think, is a good idea. So, you know, I'm not even going to clip that back onto its holder. I'm going to keep it right here next to me because in can come the food, or at least some of it. Although there isn't much in here, perhaps we can just give them all of what's in here. Yeah. I mean, if we're going to have a couple weeks between check-ins here, it kind of makes sense to be generous with the food. And mixed in with the food will be some of this type of bedding. We've already laid in recycled bedding type materials, cardboard and paper, a couple freshly added, newly repurposed feeding zone indicator type bits of bedding, now some shredded paper cardboard type mix. And before we get too far along, let's give them grit. And whenever I feed coffee, I feel like I can also include worm chow. That's just one of my little coffee deployment traditions around here. When I've got the worm chow, it usually accompanies coffee. So that's my excuse for giving them a type of food other than the coffee. So I'm cheating again. What can I say? All right, let's proceed with getting things in the feeding zone covered back up. Gives us a chance to inspect the moisture level, and you know what? As long as we're at it, let's not be skimpy with it. Let's go ahead and dampen. And I think the worms will appreciate that. Okay. All that nice leafy stuff that encountered us when we first popped in here is now getting blended and incorporated down into the material down low. Such nice texture. I guess it's kind of to be expected. Stuff that's a little bit on the dry side would definitely be the type that would have this tendency to flow and have less of a tendency to get clumped together. But you know, at this point, these worms need moisture. And I'll admit, I had a hard time spotting worms as we went through this stuff, which gave me pause. Every now and then I just felt like I had to slow down and make sure I see some movement, but it was a little slow and lethargic, making me also a little worried that perhaps the absence, or not absence, but lack of, let's just treat it that way, perhaps the lack of moisture is possibly giving the worms a little bit of limited oxygen supply, since their method of breathing is through the moisture that they come in contact with their skin. So if there's no moisture, the poor wormies suffocate, and we're certainly not at that stage. I'm just trying to illustrate the cause and effect sort of thing that happens if there's insufficient moisture to support the worms, and that's the reason I figured a good charged up bottle was a good way to start today's checking, because I want it to be super generous, and so far it feels like I've been pretty generous. I think we'll just extend my generosity a couple more moments so that we can try to bring some order here as well by rinsing off the sides of the container and rinsing off my glove, and then we can proceed to the finishing steps. We're going to cap off with our feeding zone indicators, nice new replacement feeding zone indicators going in today. There we go. And I did not come prepared with my leafy matter. I've already got it up on my shelf, but it's within reach. There we go. So we didn't even miss a beat. We can now sprinkle on some leafy matter to greet us when we return to the system next time. And it felt good to add a good bit of moisture. Hopefully the worms appreciate it. I'm sure they will, you know, because they need it. They need it desperately. None of the stuff that we're feeding these little guys comes with its own moisture. We're going to have to keep an eye on it. Otherwise, we could really risk creating an unsafe space for these little guys. So luckily the upgrade to plastic coverings that we implemented here not too long ago is doing a fine job keeping the system's existing moisture down within the bin, not letting it escape to evaporation. So I do feel like what we came into here when we first arrived was quite cozy. But as I went down, I started to wonder, the material was flowing so nice, and in one way you like it, but in another way you'd like to see more moisture. So hopefully we've accounted for what seemed to be a slight lack of moisture, and don't worry, we'll be vigilant. We'll be keeping an eye on it, and we won't let these little guys down. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.